Mississippi Born, Delta Raised is a podcast that focuses on the intersection of public health and social justice issues in the Mississippi Delta. Daphne Robinson, an attorney and public health professional, is your host. When I tell people that I'm from the Mississippi Delta, lots of ideas of what the area is like are conjured in folks' minds. They may think of the music. After all, the area is the birthplace of the blues. Or they may think of the food, barbecue, or fried chicken, Mississippi Delta hot tamales, which are different from Mexican tamales. Or they may think of our storied history of slavery and the Confederacy. But most of the time, what they think about is a community that is either black or white, with very little in between. Rarely do people think of Chinese immigrants from Southeast China owning grocery stores in primarily black communities in the Mississippi Delta from the late 1800s through the 20th century. When I grew up in Greenville in the 1970s, there was a Chinese-owned grocery store on every corner within a 5-mile radius of my home. When I look back on it now, it seems like such an interesting and fascinating story. Sometimes I've wondered if I dreamed up this idea of living in what was then such a diverse community. I guess because I wanted to confirm to myself that yes, this had been my reality in growing up, I started researching about how Chinese immigrants made their way to, of all places, the Mississippi Delta. And in that research, I found an excellent book called Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton by John Young, which confirmed everything that I witnessed growing up. Much to my delight, I learned that John listens to this podcast and left a very kind review at our Facebook page. I highly recommend the book and implore John to do an audio version for those of us that have long commutes to work and need great topics about the Mississippi Delta to listen to. Today, my guest is Meryl Woo Rice. You are going to love Mrs. Rice's story of how her family came to Lexington, a small town in Holmes County, and established several grocery stores in the heart of the black community in the 1940s and 50s. Do not be confused by Mrs. Rice's beautiful Southern accent. She is a Chinese American and speaks Chinese fluently. Mrs. Rice was born in San Francisco and was adopted by a Chinese family from Lexington and spent her childhood in the Delta. She is a graduate of Mississippi College and the University of Southern Mississippi, where she received a master's degree in social work. She is retired from the field of social work and resides in the state of Tennessee. She is the grandmother of 7 and was a delegate in 2008 to the Democratic National Convention for Barack Obama. Join me in welcoming Mrs. Rice to Mississippi Born, Delta Raised. So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how your family got to the Mississippi Delta.
Well, I don't know exactly the details. However, the story that I have been told is that my father's brother, oldest brother, came to this country in 1925. As a matter of fact, he was a stowaway on a ship.
Oh, wow.
And so he kind of hid out in the I don't know the different parts of the ship, but anyway, he hid out in the ship for 2 weeks for the whole journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure that he arrived in San Francisco. And then there were some connections in the Mississippi Delta. And so that led him to Lexington, Mississippi. When he arrived in Lexington, he opened a grocery store in the black community.
Mm-hmm.
And worked there. He worked there often. Well, I say off and on because he would take some time going back to China to sire children and to visit family and that kind of thing.
Now, it's a long way from San Francisco to Lexington, so I guess parts of the story, are you familiar with how he got from San Francisco to Lexington?
I am not.
Okay.
But I know that we had relatives in the Delta, like in Greenwood, Chula, and Isola, Inverness, those areas.
Yes.
And I'm thinking that the family in Greenwood is actually who, said, come to Mississippi. So he worked the store by himself for many years, or I say for many years, for about 10 years. And then my father joined him in 1935. And both of them were paper sons. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard that expression or not.
I have not.
Okay, well, paper sons are people who bought papers identifying themselves as children of American citizens. In other words, they immigrated to this country illegally with false papers. And the reason that they did that was because up until 1943, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act in place. Even in 1943, when it was repealed, there were only 105 Chinese a year that were allowed to immigrate to this country. And that is unless they already had relatives in this country, unless they had actually their fathers or relatives in this country who were already American citizens.
And I'm sure that there were many individuals in the Delta who were also paper sons.
Oh, there were. I did not know a family that was not the situation.
Do you know what province he came from in China, or?
Yes. In fact, most of the people that were in the Mississippi Delta came from Guangdong province.
Right, and I read that too in Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton.
And we all spoke the same dialect of Chinese.
Now, you told me that there was an interesting relationship between you and the people that raised you in the Mississippi Delta.
Okay. Well, now, my father came in 1935. Well, my mother did not come until 1948. And so when she came to this country, to Lexington, she brought with her my two male cousins, who were about 10 or 11 years old. And she left my older sister in China to stay with my aunt, because at that time it was felt that it was more important for the boys to come to this country than it was for the girls, because the idea was never to come and just live here forever. The idea was to come here. After my mother arrived in 1948, she didn't have any of her own children with her because my sister had stayed behind. And so they tried for a couple of years to have a baby, and she could not conceive. So they decided that they would go out to San Francisco and see if they could adopt a Chinese baby. And so they did. And my mother started working in a garment factory. And my father was a plumber out there. And so they stayed for several months, and she told everybody she knew that they wanted, to adopt a baby. And so one day at the garment factory, my real grandmother told her, my grandmother, this was my grandmother's garment factory. And my grandmother said, "Hey, I know somebody that is pregnant and is going to give her baby up for adoption, and I think she's going to have a boy." So she introduced my adoptive parents, the ones that came from Mississippi, to my birth mother. And so my birth mother and my adoptive father took my birth mother to the doctor, for her prenatal visits, and as his wife.
Wow.
And she went in the hospital and had me under my adoptive mother's name. So there was never any kind of real adoption. basically what happened was she gave birth to me, and then my adoptive parents came to the hospital and picked her up a couple of days later, and in a cab, and they took my birth mother, back to her apartment, and they kept me. And the story is that the next day, my adoptive father went back over to the apartment, took her a bottle of whiskey, a chicken, and $100 bill in a red envelope. Well, the Chinese custom is that after you've had a baby, that you eat this concoction that's to rebuild your body. And it has whiskey in it and peanuts and cloud's ears and different kinds of herbs. That was, and a chicken, of course. So that he was taking her some of the ingredients and the money to buy this so that she could make this soup to rebuild her body.
That is fascinating. That is a fascinating story, Ms. Rice. You have to write this down one day.
And I never knew. I never knew that I was adopted. Well, after about 8 months, we lived out there until I was about 8 months old in San Francisco, and then my family, my parents, my adoptive parents, brought me back to Mississippi, and I never knew that I was adopted until I was 46 years old.
I think I suspected when I was growing up that they lived in the stores. And so I wondered, did your family live in the stores as well?
We did. Well, when I was very, very small, like under 3, we lived in my uncle's store, in the back of my uncle's store. And then my uncle bought a house in a white neighborhood but it was actually for his son, the one of the sons that came to the States with my mother. But my father and my mother and I lived there with my 2 boy cousins. And so I was about 3 when that happened, and we lived there until I was about 8, because when I was 8, my father built his own store just across the street from my uncle's. And so we moved to the back of that store, which I thought was just horrible, because I didn't want to live in the back of the store. I wanted to live in a house like everybody else did.
Did you all eventually have a house as well with your father?
We did. Okay, so I was 8 when we moved to the back of the store, and I was probably 14 when my mother and father bought another house, also in a white neighborhood.
Your individual story is so fascinating, and then you have so much context about the larger story of Chinese Americans in the Mississippi Delta. But because the whole issue of race and being in the middle of, factions that were warring, it seemed, in the Delta, white folks and black folks, and just how difficult that must have been in growing up, trying to manage both of those worlds.
Right, because I was born in 1952. So when I was growing up, was in the middle of the civil rights movement.
Did you have problems with the African American people who lived in the community where the store was?
No, there were just a lot of people that I remember, like their taxi cab driver. They would come in, the guy that had the dry cleaners. I mean, it was like, I just thought the world of all of them.
Right.
And they would pick on me, and they would say, "When's your birthday?" And I'd say, "December the 2nd." And I was born in 1952. And I remember one of the, he wasn't a taxi driver. I can't even remember what he did, but he says, "Well, on your birthday, I'm going to give you a 50-cent piece with 1952 on it." And so, well, my birthday, I reminded him, and sure enough, he reached in his pocket and he just happened to have a 50-cent piece with 1952 on it.
It worked out for you.
And it worked out, and so he gave it to me. Our stores were in the heart of the Black community, because we kind of carved out a niche, I guess, there, where we felt like that we would be accepted more so than in the white community. And we catered to a population that was very poor. And when I say some of the things that we did, like we would we'd open a package of cigarettes and we'd sell 2 cigarettes for a nickel.
Oh, I remember that kind of thing.
Yeah. Or
I remember that very well. My parents smoked when I was growing up, and so it was going to the store on the corner owned by Asian Americans, and they sold cigarettes as singles. The community around you, of course, was very poor, but overall, the relationship was a good one.
I think so. So.
Mm-hmm. And I felt that way in growing up myself and being around, because probably at the height, I would imagine, of the time of Chinese Americans living in Greenville, I mean, there were at least 6 stores surrounding, the house that I lived in on various corners. And so, so I think there was, a very, symbiotic kind of relationship.
Well, there were Black homes behind my father's store. And when I was a small child, I would go out and play with the kids, and we'd jump rope, and I'd go to their house, and, it was kind of cool.
One of your most vivid memories of living in Delta and growing up there?
When I was playing back there, I remember as I got older, started going to school, I remember my mother telling me that maybe I shouldn't go back there and play, because she said that white people might drive by and see me, and that white people were very, she didn't call it prejudiced. She said they looked down on us. That's what she said.
And I guess that's one of the badges that we carry as citizens of, I call it the Mississippi Delta diaspora. That, part of it was the vestiges of racism, and discrimination that lingered there, that were there at the time and still linger. And,
sure.
And so often some of those memories are the ones that we carry with us.
As you got further into the heart of the Delta, there was a Chinese community there, and it was really a community because there were several families, and they had their own, some of them had their own schools, their own churches. And so there was that kind of sense of community and belonging. But in Lexington, it was just us. It was just my family.
I don't recall going to school with Chinese students at all. If there was anyone there, it may have been 1 or 2. But I couldn't tell you where they went at night or where they worshiped. I mean, there was just no interaction past the business, the transactional relationship that we had at the corner store. And in hindsight, I find that to be sad because you developed. We all developed a relationship with the people that owned the stores in our community, but that wasn't it wasn't that kind of interaction past that time. It was always kind of heartbreaking to me.
During my childhood, we went to, or at least I did, to the white churches and to the white school. But there was still a feeling of being sandwiched between 2 races.
know there are thousands of podcasts, but you're here with me. And for that, I say thank you. My name is Daphne Robinson, and I am Mississippi-born, Delta-raised.
This podcast is sponsored by the Center for Public Health and Justice. The Center for Public Health and Justice is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Its mission is to improve the public health and safety of communities in the Mississippi Delta. To learn more about our services, visit thecenterforpublichealthandjustice.org. This podcast has been a Deuce Vision production.